Questions and answers. A professor taught that St. Thomas's proofs are no good because they assume certain principles which have not been proven, such as the principle that we started with, everything that is moved by another. Or another way to state it is, wherever if there's a change, there has to be a cause of that change. And we call that the principle of causality. And it's true that I assumed it. And so then the question goes on, can you say something about the presuppositions behind St. Thomas's proof? Now, let me say a first thing here. It's impossible to reason without having a foundation on which to reason. And I think everybody, because reasoning is like building a house. And you can't build a house unless you first have a good foundation. And it's the mark of a fool. Aristotle, the founder of logic, in his great text on logic and the posterior analytics, he says it's the mark of a fool to want to demonstrate everything. Because that would be the same thing as wanting to make a house without any foundation. And it would really be the same thing as thinking that there could be movers wherever without an unmoved mover. Because when we reason, it's like this thing that we outlined on the board here. Our reasoning process is drawing conclusions from premises. And perhaps we need to support those premises with other arguments. But you clearly can't go back infinitely because all of your arguments would be standing on nothing. And so in all reasoning, you have to have a point of departure that's different from the reasoning. In other words, you have to start with something that isn't reasoned to. If somebody demands a proof of everything, they're a fool because they're wanting a building built without a foundation. Right? So it's absurd to demand a proof of everything, because that would be equivalent to conceding that we can't prove anything.
But there are people who think that.
It's true, but they haven't examined it. I think that's Aristotle's point, is examine what you're saying. You don't do that in any other sphere of life. You wouldn't want a bridge that's built on nothing. You'd want it built on foundations. And we want the same thing in every argument. We want an argument that's built on foundations that are more solid than the argument itself. Right? And so therefore, to make the long story short, every reasoning process, every argumentation, every demonstration has to presuppose that there are first principles that we naturally grasp and that we don't need to prove. And this is true whether it's moral reasoning that we're doing or theoretical reasoning. So in morals, it's the exact same thing. If somebody wanted you to prove everything in morality, that would be absurd. You have to come down to a first thing that you simply see. Good is to be done, evil avoided. How do you know? You know it. And if you put it in doubt, you make yourself mad. Right? And so there are first principles in two orders. There are first principles in the order of morals and practical reasoning, and there are first principles in the theoretical order. And there's an order to them. That's what's so marvelous, is that first principles have an order. And the first of all first principles is what's rooted in the simplest, most universal notion, being. Right? So the first principle is something can't be and not be at the same time in the same way. And everyone who knows the meaning of the word be sees it. And in the moral order, there's a first thing, and it's good. Everybody knows what good means, knows that good is to be done and evil avoided. We may disagree on what's good, but everyone knows that good is to be done. And all right, so causality is not the first principle, but it's pretty close to the first principle. Everyone who sees the meaning of moved knows that if something's moved, it's got to be moved by another. Because that's evident in the very notion of moved, that there's another moving it. So it's simply a matter of grasping the meaning of moved. And we do this by nature. It's the power, it's what makes us different from a chimp. Chimp doesn't see the principle of causality. And never will. The chimp can do all kinds of things, but he's not going to theorize. Right? The chimp's not going to say, by the way, nothing's moved that's not moved by another. And so, yes, St. Thomas presupposes the principle of causality, and all good reasoning presupposes the principle of causality. Now, some philosophers in modernity, in modern times, in the 18th century, put in doubt this. Not in practical doubt, but in a kind of theoretical, and this is David Hume. David Hume, and the reason for his error is because he's an empiricist. And an empiricist is one who doesn't recognize that the distinction between sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. In other words, denies our ability to grasp universals and essences. And if you deny that, well, obviously, our ability to grasp first principles comes from the fact that we see a universal, we see an essence. We see that it's part of the essence of to be, that it can't not be if it is. And we see it's part of the essence of to move, that it be moved. And to change, that it be caused. And that's the line of our intelligence. That's our gift. And so we have to start with our gift. And this is so important. All philosophy has to start from this common, I call this common sense. And I'm using the word common here in a strict way. Common sense, because it belongs to everybody. Everybody knows these things, and everybody does them in their practical life, even if they're a crazy philosopher like David Hume. So David Hume says, we don't know the principle of causality, theoretically. But in practice, of course we have to assume it. You couldn't possibly live for 5 minutes. If I didn't think that oncoming car was capable of making me a pancake, I wouldn't get out of its way. And so there's not anyone who doesn't presuppose the principle of causality in everything that they do all day long. Every scientist does, because what is the scientist doing? He's looking for causes. He sees something strange, he sees something change, and he thinks, why? And that's the root of all science and all philosophy and all theology. And it's
common sense.
And that's common sense. So the beauty of philosophy, what makes it, I find, one of the things that makes it so beautiful is that you don't need fancy telescopes. You don't need incredible microscopes. You don't need any equipment in reality. Because its foundation is common sense experience. Something that everybody has. And so you get this is why you can have somebody like Aristotle, who without any equipment, but he had a good teacher. Who was his teacher? Plato, for 20 years. So, but anyways, and Plato had Socrates as teacher. So you need a teacher. But you don't, all you need is what everyone has. But you need to wonder. That's the thing. And that's what most of us don't do enough. We don't wonder about the most fundamental things. Yeah. But anyway, so all philosophy is rooted in things that everyone has, and that's first principles, and reflecting on what's most basic. And so the great philosopher isn't the one who asks really bizarre questions about really bizarre things. But the philosopher is one who asks the most basic question that's so basic that nobody else bothers to ask it. So Aristotle, cause. I wonder if is that said in only one sense, or is there more than one kind of cause? There are 4 causes. Nobody else ever stops to think about it. Well, I know what cause is, and so you don't bother to think. Or movement, what's movement? It's the great philosopher who stops and thinks, what's movement? I don't... and then breaks it down into something even more primary, like potency and act. Anyway, so yes, St. Thomas's proofs presuppose something. But what do they presuppose? That which is common to every man. the natural light of intelligence that comes to us with human nature. And so to be a philosopher, you don't need to have any special gift, but you need to reflect on the common gift. Okay. And you need to have confidence in it. See, that's the thing. One of my favorite books about philosophy is Chesterton's biography of St. Thomas Aquinas. That is so magnificent. Chesterton, he was not known for being a Thomist, but he so perfectly captures what makes someone like St. Thomas so great, and that is that he's rooted. And so he makes this magnificent comparison of wisdom as it's like this tree that's the higher you go comes from the strength of your roots. And that being rooted is being rooted in plain reality, in common sense. And the great errors in philosophy and in society that kill us are from doubting, losing one's confidence in common sense, and therefore being convinced by some false argument to contradict your common sense. And I think, that's what the Bible is saying when the fool says in his heart, there is no God. The only reason you come to that is because you're convinced by some false argument against what, in a sense, it's not common in the same way as the principle of causality, but it's so close to it, because given the principle of causality, given movement in the world, it's just one step. There's got to be a first cause that's not caused. It's really just one step further than that principle of causality.
It's all the blabberdash that exists in the world today.
Yeah. Anyway, great question. In the world of science, there are scientists who believe in God and some who reject the concept of Creator. Seeing the same facts, is one group being intellectually dishonest about those facts? Well, I think the best way to answer this is that there are two different fields of thought, like we said before. In other words, it's one type of thinking that reasons well about empirical things. And it's a different discipline altogether that reasons about non-empirical causes that are more foundational. That's the difference between empirical science and philosophy. Both of them are looking for causes. Both of them are seeking a habit of mind to see conclusions in their causes and principles. But the difference is the kinds of causes they're looking for. The empirical scientist looks for empirical causes. And the philosopher looks for deeper causes that don't have to be empirical.
Okay, we hear about the scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a philosophic method?
Yeah.
Or is there more than one?
Well, sure, it's not so. So the great philosophers, like St. Thomas Aquinas, are not the systematists. So St. Thomas doesn't say, there's one way of reasoning, and that's the geometric method. And therefore, whenever we do philosophy, we have to use the geometric method. And here it is. He doesn't do anything like that. Who does that? I'm picking on poor Descartes. Descartes was mesmerized by geometry, math, and the fact that in math you don't get these endless debates, that you get a consensus in mathematics about conclusions. Right? People accept the fundamental Pythagorean theorem, and nobody stays up late at night banging their head about it. Whereas in philosophical questions, that's not the case. No, and I think that's what I was trying to say at the beginning, that there's another reason for the lack of consensus in the great philosophical questions. It's not simply because we don't have a perfect method. So much of modern philosophy has been the quest for one perfect philosophical method like the scientific method. And the great philosophers like St. Thomas don't do that. But what they do is they have this grasp of first principles, and they simply apply those principles to all different areas. And he doesn't need to say, well, there's exactly 11 first principles, and they're in this order. He doesn't do anything like that. He just says, these are the first principles, and the first of them all is this, non-contradiction, and good is to be sought, and then there are these others, and then you use them because that's the common sense of mankind. So it's actually not a good idea in philosophy, I think, to seek a method that's a scientific kind of method, because that would already be departing from philosophy's way, which is to be rooted in common sense. I mean, it's true, Aristotle writes about logic and develops, but it's a logic that's flexible to be used in different kinds of ways. I don't know if I answer that. But so I don't think you have to say that the scientist is being intellectually dishonest. I think you simply have to say he's trained in empirical science, and what we're doing tonight is something quite different. It's philosophy. So that's how I would answer that. Another question. In the big debate between evolutionists versus creationists about the origins of humankind or man, but are they arguing the same argument, or are they fighting over two different issues? How and why? Good question. I'm not sure if I... in other words, is the question about evolution... this is too big for us to get into, but I think it's so important to separate the questions. One question is, suppose among these movers and causes, we put natural selection and variation. The causes that Darwin was postulating to be the principal causes for the variation of species and the what we find in the zoo. So yes, natural variation and mutations and selection can be causes of this kind, secondary causes. But that's a whole different, whether that's the case or not is a scientific question, but it's irrelevant to our philosophical question that there's got to be a first mover outside of that whole series that's the first cause of that entire series. And that's the... so one doesn't need to get involved in the nuts and bolts in order to defend God. In other words, God is still going to be the first cause, whether Darwinian evolutionary theory can adequately explain the zoo or not. Right? They're two different questions. Now, I don't personally think that Darwinian explanation and theory explains the variety of species that we find in the zoo. But that's in no way necessary for what we did tonight. Right? That's an utterly different question. Because the first mover can make use of, and that's the marvel of the first mover, is he's in a different plane, and he can make use of secondary causes. And the more secondary causes he's able to make use of, the more marvelous is his providence. Because that's the dignity he gives to creatures, is they can cause other creatures. But the problem with Darwin is here. You've got this problem. How do you go from the less to the more without the more planning it out?
How would a Darwinist or a theistic evolutionist, how would he explain the fall?
Well, they don't. I think that the tendency would be to, in effect, reinterpret that doctrine in a way that makes it very different.
But the Darwinist isn't interested in the moral history of mankind.
Right.
He's interested in the natural history of our bodies. And, Darwin didn't take a voyage around the world and look at the way finches varied and so forth and conclude immediately that there was no creator. It was others who did that.
Right, but I do think that there's, again, in this field, like in so many others, it's so easy to make a confusion between the fields. It's so easy for the biologist to illegitimately, in other words, without properly realizing it, step out of biology into metaphysics, without acknowledging that change and without changing the way he's thinking. In other words, without using a method proper to metaphysics. In other words, from the fact that I can explain the variations within a species by natural selection and mutation, that doesn't say anything about the necessity of an intelligence guiding the process.
Well, it's like a scientist would ask. You say because they're in this field, they're confined to it. It seems like they would have broader knowledge.
Right. You see, you're right, and that's what the Book of Wisdom was saying, is that what ought to happen, and this is, I think, the beauty that those believing scientists, the satisfaction that they find is that the more we know about nature, the more marvelous this this order and design, and therefore it enables us to praise more the wisdom of the Creator. I mean, that's the point of Wisdom 13. And so the believing scientist can have that magnificent satisfaction of being able to do both things in a way. In other words, as a scientist, he's seeing the secondary causes and then stepping out, looking at the whole picture more from the philosophical point of view. How marvelous. And the danger is that if one refuses to step outside, one can lose this sense of wonder. Now, I don't know enough about this, but it would be interesting to look more into Darwin's biography, because from just some snippets that I know from letters and his diaries, he, in his early life, he was, well, for one thing, he was an Anglican minister and a believer in his early period. And not only that, a great lover of literature and beauty in nature and art. And at the end of his life, he laments that he's lost his ability to rejoice in beauty, whether it's in nature or in art. And so he mentions reading Shakespeare makes him ill rather than exhilarated as it had when he was young. And he sees this as a great kind of tragedy. Now, I mean, obviously this is something personal and there could be many causes. But I wonder, reading things like that, if there isn't something in his being unable to move out of these brackets that's behind that loss of this sense of beauty. And that leads to another question about beauty in the scientist. And so the question asks, do we study today the beauty of created things, like in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 13? Does the empirical scientist do that? Or do we just study their structures? Now, I think the great scientists are precisely the ones who have an intuition of beauty. And that's what leads them to make a great scientific theory. But what's helping them is some sense that this explanation is more elegant and more beautiful, and that's got to be the right one. And I think that's the right way to go. That's the way to do science, to be guided by that intuition as to what's the more beautiful, elegant. So my dad, atheist, this is how he explained to me that this is physicist operates. Right? The elegant solution, you can be sure, is the right one. Even if you don't yet have the evidence for it, be sure, follow that confidence, and you'll find the evidence, and you'll be right. Right? And the history of science in the 20th century just bears this out time and time again. What's behind that? What's behind that is precisely this. That, and we're going to explore this more next week. This uncaused cause is an intelligent designer. And he is an artist. Right. He's an artist, and he's the artist, the divine artist. And the divine artist has planted beauty into all things. And that's why when we look at these faraway galaxies and blow them up with these incredible telescopes, they're so stunningly beautiful. And that's why the great theories are stunningly beautiful if you can appreciate them. The elegance even of the formulas and the mathematics of it. It makes sense that they would be. But if there's no God, it doesn't make any sense, and that wouldn't seem to be a good way to work. If there's no God and everything's absurd, you wouldn't expect to find order.
But wouldn't a well-Christian
Mhm.
education
Uh-huh.
on a collegiate level, where they're taking these courses not just before they specialize, that would give them
Yeah.
the emphasis, but
Right.
it doesn't exist.
Right. I think a big part of this is simply the practical bent of our culture. I mean, we're so practical. We don't think it's worthwhile to do physics and mathematics simply to admire the beauty of it. We don't do this enough. And it's interesting that recent popes have been stressing very much the importance of beauty and the importance of rediscovering beauty. And John Paul II has some, you could go back. Pius XII has a great discourse. But John Paul VI of the Second Vatican Council, John Paul II, but especially Pope Benedict. He came back to it again and again. And at one point he quotes Dostoevsky with this line, I'm going to butcher it, but something to this effect. Without bread, we can live without bread. All right, maybe not totally, but we can live without the abundance of bread that we have. We can live without many, many things, but without beauty, you wouldn't have a motivation to do anything, to get up in the morning. And he says the secret of life lies there. And the importance of beauty for the believer, the importance of cultivating beauty so as to see this better. Right? Cultivating beauty in our surroundings, taking time simply to marvel at the beautiful, because the beautiful points to its adequate cause. And we'll explore this more next week. Okay. One last question here. This is tongue-in-cheek. If the speed of light is a limit, is there something faster to make it move? Right. Obviously, but the very fact that their speed of light has a limit. In other words, there's this constant in it. It's this speed and not some other speed, and that we can formulate that and we can get a number, and that is remarkable when you think about it. In other words, the very fact that there's something constant, that shows that it's not chance. Why? Because chance is what's indeterminate. Chance is whatever. That is the exact opposite of what we find when we look out in the world. When we look out in the world, we find determination. Determination planted everywhere. And a determination just so precise, and it turns out, wow, that precision of that number in the speed of light makes it possible for us to be sitting here and doing philosophy. Because if it were ever so different, the conditions would be such that we wouldn't be able to sit here, and we wouldn't exist at all.
We would all be amoebas.
Right. So, on that note,